Well, welcome everybody to another edition of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck. And of course, as always, that means some smart talk radio is in your future. In this segment, interesting subject and a difficult one at times, I'm sure. Indeed, we're going to be talking to Patrick Phillips. Who is Patrick Phillips? He's an award-winning poet, translator, and professor. He's a Guggenheim and National Endowment of the Arts Fellow, and was a finalist also for the National Book Award in Poetry. He lives in New York City. Actually lives in Brooklyn, and he teaches at Drew University a brand new work called Blood at the Root, A Racial Cleansing in America. Should be an interesting conversation indeed. Patrick, how are you, my friend?
I'm doing very well. Thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, you bet. Racial Cleansing in America, that is probably to some a sort of a startling title, powerful if nothing else. Share with our Lewis at Large listeners, if you would, how you came up with the title and give us just the overview of the work itself.
Sure. The book is about the racial cleansing of my home county in North Georgia, Forsyth County, Georgia, which is in the Appalachian foothills about 30 miles north of Atlanta. And the title really comes from the fact that it best describes what happened there in 1912. There was a black community in the census of 1910 of 1,098 citizens. It included sharecroppers, field hands, but also, educated black ministers, school teachers, tradesmen. And over the course of 2 months in the fall of 1912, they were run out by bands of night riders who used arson and gunfire, dynamite to terrorize the black community. And that racial ban that was instituted in the fall of 1912 really held for almost 100 years and on into my childhood there in the 1970s and 80s.
What about, share with our Lewis at Large listeners, Patrick, if you would, what was the environment like in the Phillips home as you grew up?
Well, my parents are both from Birmingham, Alabama, and they were among a wave of young professionals who had moved north to Forsyth County from Atlanta. So my father's a Methodist minister. My mother was a school teacher and a professional writer. And they had come to Atlanta from Birmingham. They were really veterans of the civil rights battles in Birmingham. They had seen, the real insanity of segregation as young people in Birmingham. And so they were fairly progressive around race. They had a rift with their own parents and their own families in the 50s and early 60s around all of that. So my parents were very much they were dissenters from all of this in Forsyth County, but at the same time, there was nothing new about it to them. So they had grown up in the Birmingham of Bull Connor and George Wallace, and they were familiar with all of this. And really the atmosphere when I was a kid was, my parents told us, we were going to try to change the place from within.
One of the things of historical significance here, beyond obviously the story, was the guy occupying the White House at the time was Woodrow Wilson. And I don't know that most Americans would associate Woodrow Wilson necessarily with racism or would even connect those two subjects with him. But share with us a little bit of your thoughts about that.
Yeah, Wilson comes into the story very much. I didn't know that that's where the book was going to go, but it was unavoidable because Woodrow Wilson was elected in 1912, the same year that the racial cleansing happens. He was elected in a three-way race with William Howard Taft and Teddy Roosevelt, and in order to gain the White House, he really needed the support of the black community and black voters. And people like W.E.B. Du Bois, leading black intellectuals, endorsed Wilson over they would usually vote Republican, and they endorsed a Democrat, and he was one of the first Democrats to get widespread support from black voters. So Du Bois made it clear that he thought Wilson really owed his place in the White House to black voters and called upon him to use the position to fight for racial equality. What happened instead is that very soon after he got to the White House, Wilson segregated the civil service. He segregated parts of the federal government that had been integrated since Reconstruction. And he really set the gears in reverse as far as equality between 1912. I guess his term was 1913 and 1921 is when he served. So in the book, I do make the case that Wilson really set a national tone that emboldened some of the white supremacists in places like Forsyth County.
I'm just curious as to, again, you're a salt of the earth, so to speak, if you were raised in Forsyth County. I'm curious as to, since the book has come out, and at least the word of the book has come out, I'm curious as to the reaction of your acquaintances back there. What have they said to you so far?
It's been mixed, and I've talked with people. I did an event in Atlanta that was one of the first events related to the launch of the book, and there were plenty of people there from Forsyth County. Many of them were relieved and happy that I had written the book and that someone had, really what this book was about was getting into the archives, going and doing a lot of interviews. There was a lot of footwork and hustle to try to track down the real story that lay behind the myth. So I've talked to a lot of people who are very happy that someone has finally tried to supplant all of that myth with some fact-based, researched version of the story. At the same time, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution excerpted part of the book in the newspaper, and I looked at the comment section online, and of course there are voices from within Forsyth who say, why is he dredging this up? We're never going to heal if you don't leave this alone. This is making the problem worse. And that's something that I heard a lot growing up as a kid. That's something that you find going all the way back really to 1912. The newspaper articles used to often end by saying no more trouble at coming, no further trouble expected. And there was this tendency to assume that each episode of violence was the last one and that things were now going to be okay if people would just leave them alone. So I don't believe that, but that's something that I still am hearing from people in the county who I think aren't so happy that I've written this book.
Yeah. If you just joined us, yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck of Lewis at Large Radio. In this segment, we're talking to Patrick Phillips. He's an award-winning poet, translator, and professor at Drew University. Lives back east. A brand new work called Blood at the Root, A Racial Cleansing in America, all about life in Forsyth County in Georgia in the early 1900s. As you did this research, where'd you go for research? Did you go local, or were there, obviously there were some things online, but I'm just curious as to who you talked to, where you researched, and were the stories forthcoming and easy, or was it a difficult research piece?
It took a lot of legwork, and the truth of the story was really scattered all over the place. I went to the National Archives, looked in the Freedmen's Bureau records, looked in the Georgia State Archives. I spent a lot of time in the basement of the Forsyth County Courthouse. So a lot of it was really time in libraries and looking for every last scrap I could find of contemporary evidence and contemporary witnesses' accounts of this. A key find was a letter written by a woman named Ruth Mae Jordan, who was a 14-year-old when all of this happened, and she witnessed it, and she wrote her memories down in 1980, and she wrote a letter to her son that he was willing to share with me, that where she says that it weren't the Klan done this, it was just ordinary people of the county, and that was a real bombshell. And then I did also track down descendants of some of the African American families who were forced out. I used Ancestry.com. Some of the research I think was made possible by the digital revolution, and some of this. We think of, as time goes on, we think that things in the past become less clear. But in this case, I think some of it was more knowable now than it would have been if I had been trying to do this 20 years ago.
You're telling a story about what happened in northern Georgia, but let's face it, this is not dissimilar, undoubtedly, to communities, large and small, all across the Southeast. As you researched this, were you told of other stories in other places?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And since the book has come out, people have come up to me, and I should say not just from the Southeast, I think all over the country. There's an amazing book by a historian named James Lowen called Sundown Towns, and he finds evidence in the census records for what he calls population collapse, where there is a black community, and then 10 years later, inexplicably, there's suddenly no one left in the census data. And frequently, when he goes to those places and starts probing for oral history, there is a story of something that went wrong, like in Tulsa, like in Rosewood, Florida, like in Forsyth County, Georgia. So, and similar things happened on the West Coast to the Asian community. I have a friend who's worked on the history of parts of Nebraska. So I think this isn't limited to the Southeast, and it's something that went on all over the country. The unique thing about Forsyth County is just the longevity of it, in that we think of these things as something from the distant past. I grew up in a county that was still known as a white county. It was still enforced during my childhood there in the 70s and 80s. I still remember seeing, black delivery drivers and truck drivers who were terrified to get out of if they had a flat tire, they would be afraid to get out in Forsyth County for fear of a mob.
What about, I'm curious as you research this, were you surprised, stunned, about some of the facts and some of the incidents you heard about, and also in any of your research, was some of it, did it make you actually feel better about certain things maybe that you had thought the other way about?
Yeah, that's a great question. Among the things that were appalling is that I was always told that, yes, the racial purge in Forsyth was tragic, but among the white community, it was common to say, well, but there was a white woman was raped and murdered by young black men. And so, yes, it was tragic, but it was a reaction to a horrific crime. And when I looked at the facts, the trial of these young black men, one of them was pulled out of the county jail and lynched on the town square, but two others were convicted. And that was often something people pointed to say, well, look, they did it, so this was simply eye for an eye. But the reality is those two boys were tried by a guy named Newt Morris, who would later himself preside over a lynching of a man named Leo Frank in 1915 in Atlanta, a very famous lynching. Two of the jurors were Klansmen. The sheriff was a Klansman. A couple of the other attorneys were involved in the lynching of Leo Frank as well. So it was appalling to realize that what had been presented as a fair trial and as the wheels of justice there's no evidence that they got a fair hearing at all. But as far as the second part of your question about whether there were things that made me feel a little more hopeful, I was surprised to find that the white community was not unanimously part of this. There were people who opposed it. There was a mayor who fought against it. There are letters in the archives of the governor where white people are sounding the alarm and saying, look, we need help. We need federal troops. We need the federal judiciary to get involved in this. And unfortunately, those calls for help fell on deaf ears.
Patrick, we are in the midst of some incidents across the country, and it doesn't matter. It's not limited, as you mentioned earlier, to geography. It's happened in Florida. It's happened in Baltimore. It's happened in St. Louis. It's happened in Charlotte, North Carolina, on and on and on. What is it about this ability? Race relations in America continues to be an extraordinary challenge in a land of extraordinary opportunity. Why can't we seem to get this right?
It's a very, very difficult question and something that I've grappled with a lot. And, I would be a fool if I suggested that I have figured out race in America. That's an overwhelming and monumental task for us all. The one thing that I learned in the course of writing the book is that there's no way forward that doesn't involve looking back. And I feel that a lot of we have never had our version of truth and reconciliation hearings like in South Africa, Nelson Mandela's model for how to heal. And I think there are a lot of people in America who want the rewards of that process, which is reconciliation, without going through the very painful, difficult process, which is telling the truth about and turning and facing it. And I think right now a lot of white people and black people in America have different histories in their heads and different ideas of what the 20th century was like for African Americans. So, this book was my attempt to add one small piece to that giant and really overwhelming puzzle by saying, I think I can find out the truth about my home. And I think, a lot of places in America could at least take a step towards reconciliation by turning and facing their own really complicated and often painful truths.
What kind of reaction are you getting overall from those in the black community?
That's also a complicated one in that I've gotten lots of people who are very helpful or very grateful, especially people from the area. I was in contact with a lot of families who are descended from the black people in Forsyth County, the refugees who fled. And, a lot of wonderful friendships have come out of that. And some of those people, I think, are grateful to know more about their own ancestors and more about stories that were told in whispers or often not at all. Many of those families told me that their grandfathers or great-grandfathers never talked about it, that it was too painful. So I think it's a complicated one in that this is a painful history. I think that there was a lot of shame, not justly, but that there was shame and embarrassment about this. I talked to some people, someone who said that their grandfather always told people he was from Chicago just to avoid, he left out the Georgia part of his upbringing just to avoid the whole thing. So I think it's difficult and painful, and I also understand that there's a lot of desire in the black community to focus on positive messages and to not have this history define the present. But, at the same time, I think there's a certain amount of there's also an understanding that if white and black America have these two different understandings of our history, that it's going to be very difficult to heal or to move forward.
As you, again, we're talking to Patrick Phillips. He's a professor at Drew University, but he's also a renowned author and poet, a brand new work called Blood at the Root, A Racial Cleansing in America, all about Forsyth County in northern Georgia in 1912 and in that area, or in that era. Patrick, as you completed this work, does it inspire you to do more work on the same subject, or do you feel like you've told this story and you're ready to move on to something completely different?
Oh, that's a great question, because when you're writing a book like this and spending a lot of time in the archives, and the book is the distillation of a real mountain of research, there are all these other pathways that I didn't go down. So I could easily see writing on these kinds of subjects again. One of the things that I found that was astonishing was in my research about Forsyth County during the days right after emancipation was all of these hearings in the Freedmen's Bureau records. The Freedmen's Bureau was the federal agency created by Abraham Lincoln just a month before he died. Military men were sent to southern towns and counties to enforce emancipation and to enforce the idea that former slaves had to be paid for their labor. And among those records were these binding cases, which refers to cases where former slave children would be, quote, bound out to a white man, and they were called apprentices. But the more I read these, the more it started to seem like a case of children who were re-enslaved, even though emancipation was supposed to be the law of the land. So I would love to go and look further into that whole idea. They were often declared orphans even though they weren't. There was testimony from parents going to the Freedmen's Bureau and asking for help retrieving what they called their stolen children. So it was a really heartbreaking story, but some of that is back there in the archives, and it's a road I wasn't able to go down because I was focused on this story, so I could easily see continuing working on that.
All right. Well, it is not an easy read. It's a difficult read, but it's an important read. The work is called Blood at the Root, A Racial Cleansing in America by Patrick Phillips. Again, and Patrick, if you would, how can our Lewis at Large listeners pick up a copy of this, and also how can they find out a little bit more about the subject and about some of the work you do?
There are links to the book. The book is available on Amazon and Powell's and Barnes & Noble and pretty much everywhere. My website is patrickphillipsbooks.com, and that's PHILLIPS, patrickphillipsbooks.com, and there's a gallery of photographs there. There's a lot of information about the book and about the rest of my work.
Well, I appreciate you being on with us today, and extraordinary work that you've done here, and would love to have you back on again someday.
Well, I'd love that. It was a pleasure being on. Thank you so much.
You bet. We will be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.